On the 8th of February 1587, one of the most shocking events in British history took place. A 44-year-old woman, an anointed queen, was led to the block and decapitated. Her death warrant had been signed by her own cousin. The Queen was Mary, Queen of Scots, and the warrant was signed by Elizabeth I of England.
The death of Mary was a terribly brutal death of a woman who faced it with enormous courage.
Was Mary the innocent victim of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth?
If you want to go on a date with either Mary or Elizabeth, I tell you, you pick Mary every time.
Or a power-hungry predator and cold-blooded killer who deserved everything she got?
Her worst habit is choosing terrible men and then letting herself be dominated by them.
Mary's downfall is a story of sex, scandal and murder, and at its heart, it is a fight to the death between two queens for the throne of England.
Can it be that Mary, Queen of Scots, doesn't understand that she's Elizabeth's nemesis?
In July 1565, Mary, Queen of Scots, was married. As a young, beautiful Queen of Scotland, Mary had her pick of men across Europe.
She's pretty, she's engaging, she's a catch. People write about her, how wonderful she is. She's witty, charming.
And the thing that was said about Mary was that when she was speaking to you, she was totally magnetic. You were the only person that seemed to matter to her at that time.
She really was incredibly striking. She had this marvellous auburn hair, these great big eyes, beautiful skin, and most strikingly of all, she was 6 foot tall.
The groom was an Englishman named Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Unusually for a queen, Mary was marrying for love.
She is really infatuated with him. She was like a teenager. This is writing on your school jotter, Mrs. Darnley. This is just crash. She just falls for him.
But in fact, it was the first big mistake that would ultimately cost Mary her life. Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, were cousins by shared royal blood. Although they had never met in person, the two queens often wrote to each other. Their letters appeared loving, but between the lines there lay a fierce rivalry.
There is always going to be some personal jealousy between two, handsome queens, especially when, to be blunt, Mary is prettier than Elizabeth.
What worried Elizabeth most was that her Scottish cousin had English royal blood in her veins.
Mary's claim to the English throne, for many people, is absolutely indisputable. Because she was, of course, direct descendant of Margaret, one of Henry VIII's sisters, and therefore she's absolutely directly in line with Tudor blood.
What terrifies Elizabeth is this idea that Mary might continue to claim the throne in Elizabeth's own lifetime. That really is the core of Elizabeth's concern about Mary.
Now Mary had married an Englishman who strengthened her claim to Elizabeth's throne.
The person with the best dynastic claim after Mary to the English throne is in fact Henry Lord Darnley.
Not Darnley. Not the ghastly Darnley.
Who of course is also, like Mary herself, he's a great-grandson of Henry VII. Mary chose Darnley because dynastically he was the best possible bet.
It wasn't only Elizabeth who was alarmed by this marriage. It was also the Scots. Darnley, like Mary, was a Catholic, but Scotland was a Protestant country, and Mary's court was dominated by ruthless Protestant lords.
If you look at the noble houses of Scotland at the time, they were just like a great big bunch of boys behaving really badly, and she steps right into the middle of this.
She knew that she had to cooperate with the leading lords, even though she was a Catholic and they were Protestant. Her problem was that she was too trusting.
For the Protestant lords, being ruled by a Catholic queen with a Catholic husband was a double nightmare.
You can't fault Mary as a ruler in Scotland until she marries Henry, Lord Darnley. That's when the trouble starts.
None of this mattered to Mary. She had married the man she loved.
She's about as good at making decisions as a spoilt princess would be. I will make my decision and you will all do as I say.
The woman who produces a boy has done the job, the main job. Doesn't matter who you are, if you do that, you have succeeded.
Problem is that she's just become expendable. If people now want to get rid of her, they have an alternative heir to the throne in their hands.
That was a problem for the future. Right now, Mary had a more urgent concern. Her relationship with her new husband, Darnley, was already beginning to unravel.
Drunk, violent, vicious, extremely effeminate, throwing fits of temper.
But he's one of those blokes who knows how to behave until the ring's on the finger.
He was becoming a pain. He was becoming a bore. He was drinking far too much.
He's incredibly vain. He's incredibly narcissistic. He's got no sense of how dangerous these Scottish lords can be.
But it wasn't just bad boy behavior that made Darnley a threat to Mary. He had dangerous political ambitions too.
She has chained herself to a man who is increasingly trying to take charge of Scottish affairs. He himself, and Darnley says this explicitly, is frustrated that he is not being treated like a king.
He resented the child, he resented his wife, and there began to be discussions about what on earth you could do with him to get rid of him.
Little did Mary know that her decision to marry Lord Darnley was about to blow up in her face. In February 1567, Mary Queen of Scots took one step closer on the road to her death. Mary's husband, Lord Darnley, was brutally and spectacularly murdered.
To try and blow somebody up is about the most careless, the most slovenly way of going about an assassination.
Actually, the great explosion doesn't kill Darnley. He gets out of the window. And there wasn't actually a mark on his body, but a closer examination showed that he'd been strangled.
There's two bodies in the orchard. One of them, a servant, and the other one is Darnley, just in his nightshirt.
This is a modern terrorist atrocity. It's not just the murder of a man in a garden. It is an attempt to destabilise the whole of Scotland.
And all of Europe is aghast. This is absolutely terrible.
Everyone wanted to know who killed Lord Darnley. The chief suspect was a man named James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell.
James Hepburn, the borderer, the swaggering borderer, close friends with our Queen. Suspicion started straight away.
Bothwell was a man who liked chaos. Look again at the fact that he chose to murder Darnley, not with a knife, not with a gun, but with gunpowder. His motive there was to destabilise Scotland, to create such a civil war that he could hope to emerge from it the victor.
Bothwell was one of Mary's closest allies at the Scottish court. But now he was a prime suspect in her husband's murder. Refusing to distance herself from him was Mary's next fatal mistake.
Bothwell steps forward and he says to Mary, "It's easy. I will be your protector." Now, Bothwell is somebody who is undoubtedly, he's a charismatic and attractive figure, but he's a Jekyll and Hyde. He has a smooth side and he has a dark side. He's a thug.
He is horrendously ambitious. He's incredibly flamboyant. He has immense self-esteem.
He's dashing, he's a man of action. He is just the sort of person to sweep a lady off her feet.
Elizabeth is horrified by the murder of Darnley, and as always, Elizabeth's concern is with reputation. When she writes to Mary, she says that the most shocking thing is that she's hearing that Mary is continuing to associate publicly with Bothwell when everybody knows that he's guilty. She urges Mary to have a public inquiry.
What Mary does instead is absolutely nothing, which enables all the rumours to sprout the most luxuriant weeds of gossip, innuendo, and accusation.
In Edinburgh and beyond, there was talk of an affair between Bothwell and Mary.
Rude drawings come out. The Mermaid and the Hare, which is a sort of deeply sexual image. Posters were sort of mass-produced and being sort of nailed up.
Unlike Elizabeth I, Mary Stuart was very careless with her sexual reputation. Elizabeth had already established herself as a sacrosanct monarch, as a woman you wouldn't dream of touching. Mary's problem was that in the Scottish sexual imagination, she'd already established herself as a slut.
The most dangerous rumour of all was that Bothwell had an accomplice in Darnley's murder, and that accomplice was Mary.
Mary had no motive to kill Darnley. I mean, it's quite easy, isn't it, to imagine that, oh, well, you know, because Mary's queen, she must have had something to do with this.
There is clear evidence that Mary knew about the murder plot in advance.
She may have facilitated it by arranging for Darnley to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Mary was in the most perilous position of her life. Now Bothwell was about to drag her over the brink. Six miles west of Edinburgh, Mary was intercepted by Bothwell and a large group of his men.
It's often said, well, you know, couldn't Mary have escaped? Couldn't she have shouted for help? And all that? I mean, it's a bit difficult to do when you're surrounded by 800 armed men.
She was taken to a castle nearby. There, Bothwell locked her in a bedroom.
I think it is certainly possible that Mary, Queen of Scots, colluded with Bothwell to set up a false abduction in which she could claim to be completely innocent but forced into a marriage of convenience.
It's very theatrical. Why would he bother with this incredible theatricality of the abduction? Why the big scene? Are they colluding in some way so she's got a get-out clause? What could I do? These men are armed.
Later that night, Bothwell came to Mary's bedroom and began to undress her.
In my view, there's absolutely no doubt that this was not a rape. She is led against her will to Dunbar. That is, I believe, certainly true. But at Dunbar, he talks her round and he seduces her. And they sleep together.
I think it would, in modern terms, certainly be viewed as a rape, the submission of a woman against her will and her better judgment. It took a lot of nerve, I would think, to force yourself on an anointed queen, but Bothwell had a lot of nerve.
Mary is no victim here.
We'll never know for sure what happened at Dunbar Castle. What we do know is that 3 weeks later, Bothwell got exactly what he wanted.
Historians don't agree on very much about Mary, but one thing in which they all agree is she should never have married Bothwell.
To many people, this second marriage confirmed the Queen's involvement in Darnley's murder. In London, Elizabeth was horrified.
There's nothing more Elizabeth dreads at this precise moment than reading the missives from Scotland in the morning. She can't bear them. Scottish news just, sends her into a tailspin of despair.
She says, why are you doing this as a queen? You have to remember your own dignity, your own status. She pretty explicitly says to Mary, you are damaging the status of all queens in these islands as you do this.
I believe that Elizabeth had all along decided that she would never marry. Because she knew that if you did, you would end up like Mary with Darnley or Mary with Bothwell.
By marrying Mary, Bothwell was pursuing his ruthless determination to be king. But far from being Mary's protector, he had left Mary open to the biggest danger of all, losing her crown. For the Protestant lords, his ambition had gone one step too far.
There's no actual fight because Mary doesn't want it. Again, Mary's a fundamentally decent person. She doesn't want this to happen. And a deal is worked out in which Bothwell is allowed to flee.
When Mary gives herself up at Carberry Hill, she really seems to believe she's being put back as queen with a new government. She is obviously horrified and devastated to find herself a prisoner.
She was imprisoned at a remote castle outside Edinburgh. Her baby son, James, was taken into the care of the Protestant lords. Mary would never see him again.
Emotionally, she's a broken woman. Well, what's going to happen? What are they going to do to me?
Mary's world was collapsing around her. In July, still a prisoner, she miscarried Bothwell's twins, only a few weeks after they had been conceived. Shortly afterwards, some Protestant lords arrived in her bedroom with an ultimatum.
Sign. Abdicate in favour of your son. Sign. And some people believe that she was threatened with a knife, that they would cut her throat.
Mary's baby son, James, was declared king. In practice, the Protestant lords now ruled Scotland.
The really interesting thing is that in London, when Elizabeth hears of this, she thinks this is a worse thing to happen than even the murder of Lord Darnley. a God-appointed ruler, to be forced to abdicate by bolshy nobles. This is absolutely the pits. Nothing could be worse. The roof falls in.
Elizabeth was concerned about what had happened to a fellow monarch. That if this can happen to Mary, Queen of Scots, it could conceivably, in the worst case scenario, happen to me.
Mary had lost everything. Her husband, her son, her throne. But she wasn't ready to give up. Instead, she would stake the only thing she had left, her life, on a huge gamble. A year after being forced to give up her crown, Mary Queen of Scots' position seemed hopeless. She had been dethroned, imprisoned and abandoned, and a group of Protestant lords controlled Scotland in her baby son's name. But Mary hadn't lost hope. She wanted her throne back, and the only way to get it was to escape.
And she charms her way out of Lochleven. I mean, she basically gets people to help her and she gets away.
The escape is just brilliantly arranged. It's Mary back on form.
Now Mary had a big decision to make. Where should she go next?
There are two obvious places. One is France, where she can make new friends in Europe. The other is get to England, because she's been led to believe that Elizabeth is totally on her side.
To go to England was the far more dangerous option, but Mary chose to take it.
She rode, and she says that she rode 60 miles in a single night. She said she lived for 3 nights like the owls, drinking sour milk.
She was a very, very frightened young woman. Frightened, unwell, overwhelmed by everything that had happened to her in the last sort of 18 months.
The day after she arrived in England, Mary wrote to Elizabeth, asking for help.
I entreat you to send to fetch me as soon as you possibly can, for I am in a pitiable condition. I have nothing in the world but what I had on my person when I made my escape.
Mary clearly doesn't recognise that there is much animosity between her and Elizabeth at this point, which is, frankly, pretty stupid.
Mary went to England because Elizabeth had written to her and said, I want to help you. Elizabeth was furious about the way she was treated when she was first incarcerated. Elizabeth said, this is terrible. Dreadful the way you're being treated. I'll do all I can for your comfort, sweet sister and cousin. So Mary, not unreasonably, thought, I'll call in that particular offer.
No one expects Mary to rock up in England. What are they going to do with her? She's on the run from her own people. She's Catholic. She has a claim to the throne, and this is a massive diplomatic problem.
Elizabeth's got the wrong religion, Protestant, to be accepted by most of Europe, Catholic. So this is big-time insecurity.
Elizabeth is in a tricky place. Half her 3 million subjects are still Catholic. Many of them prayed fervently every night that Mary, Queen of Scots, would soon wear Elizabeth's crown.
Instead of offering her support to Mary, Elizabeth did precisely the opposite.
Initially, she is under house arrest, but under house arrest in a very graceful manner. She has all her things around her, she has servants, she has ladies, and when she wants to go and take the waters in Buxton, very good for the health, she has a proper royal procession there. So she is still a queen.
Then there were horses allowed for her, people to cook her food, arguably a good idea in case she was poisoned, people to look after even her hair. She's supposed to have had the most expensive hairdresser in Europe.
I mean, she's bored witness. And she's quite good at needlecraft just because she is bored, I guess. But as the confinement goes on, it gets worse and worse and worse and worse.
Over the following months, Mary wrote a stream of desperate letters to Elizabeth, begging her for help.
Madam, I beseech you to favour your equal. I have placed my whole trust in you. I rely so entirely on your promised friendship that no reports can persuade me to the contrary.
But Elizabeth remained hard-hearted. To the Protestant Queen, her Catholic cousin Mary was radioactive. And she was right.
Six months after she's arrived, she's already writing to Catholic earls, asking for their help to free her by force of arms, if necessary.
Unfortunately for Mary, it would not be that easy. But she knew one thing for certain. As a Catholic in a country that had only turned Protestant 9 years earlier, her golden ticket to freedom was her religion.
Remember, because England had gone Protestant in 1559 didn't mean people were Protestant. A very narrow cohort were Protestant. They're a narrow clique trying to take over the culture of an entire country.
There are so many Catholics being imprisoned, they think about creating a colony for them in Florida. In those days, it would be like sending them to the moon. And it didn't come off, but it was a demonstration of how desperate they were.
As England teetered on the edge of insurrection, all Mary cared about was getting her freedom. In London, Elizabeth saw things very differently. She was ever more anxious to keep Mary her prisoner.
Mary is periodically very much on Elizabeth's mind, not least when there are plots detected to bust Mary from prison and or murder Elizabeth, which happens at regular intervals.
Elizabeth is living in a very dangerous time. There's been a fatwa taken out against her, and assassination attempts are being foiled right, left and centre. Not even in her own palace does she feel comfortable.
But there was someone who could help. A man whose dearest ambition was to get rid of Mary.
Cecil, beyond any doubt, hates Mary's guts because she is a Catholic. And to Cecil, Catholics simply are the enemy. He is a conviction politician driven by religious ideology, and he'll do anything to stop Mary becoming ruler.
With every new Catholic plot uncovered, Cecil tightened the security around Mary, and he started to make a plan.
Cecil's job description is 1, keep Queen alive, 2, keep Queen Queen. So he will do anything to do that.
Cecil gets out of bed every morning and says, I've got to kill the Queen of Scots, I've got to kill the Queen of Scots. He won't rest till she's dead.
In prison, Mary was unaware of the danger she was in. She continued writing letters to her cousin Elizabeth.
I have been detained far from my country, and your presence is denied. I do not think I have merited such treatment. I will wait patiently for some favourable news from you, which I have been expecting for such a long time. I pray and require you, as affectionately and earnestly as possible, that you will no longer delude the rest of my miserable days with vain hope.
As the months turned into years, Mary began to feel Cecil's net tightening around her.
Elizabeth places greater and greater restrictions on Mary's liberty of movement, until she is simply a prisoner in some horrid conditions, like a ruptured lavatory running down the wall outside her chamber.
At one point, she wasn't even allowed to go to the window for fear of signalling. She wasn't allowed to move about freely. She wasn't allowed to leave the grounds. It was as if Elizabeth wanted to break her spirit.
Mary's last hope of ever getting out of jail and becoming a queen again is her son, because he, after all, is her son. And if he can be prevailed upon to have some kind of filial affection, then Mary can be brought back to Scotland on some kind of terms.
Shortly after becoming king, James wrote to Mary, but his message was devastating.
James, Mary's son, writes her a letter saying, well, I'll always recognise you as Queen Mother, but you ain't going to be Queen. This is my kingdom now. I've got it.
It must have been such a staggering blow. She didn't even have a chance to be a mother. So she's been hanging on to this dream that one day he would come and rescue her. But how could he do that? He'd been brought up by ultra-Protestant adherents who told him that his mother was just wicked and evil, and how could a little boy believe anything else if that's all you've been told?
She has been betrayed by her own son. This is the most catastrophic thing that's ever happened to her. For Mary now, that is the moment when she says, okay, anything goes.
Abandoned by her only son, Mary turned again to Elizabeth. In a letter to the English Queen later that month, Mary begged, once and for all, to be let go. But Elizabeth remained hard-hearted.
Mary is left with only one option, really, now, which is to murder Elizabeth.
Mary, Queen of Scots, had been held prisoner at the hand of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth, for nearly 19 years.
She's lonely, she's depressed, she's increasingly ill, she's desperate.
But Mary was no longer the victim desperate for her freedom. She was a Catholic rebel who wanted to murder the Protestant Queen of England and seize her throne. In July 1586, Mary received a letter from a group of Catholic conspirators led by a man named Anthony Babington.
Anthony Babington believes that he can free Mary. He can start a rebellion which will put Mary on the throne. Crucially, he also thinks that he can do away with the usurper, which is Elizabeth.
The messages would be wrapped up very thin and hidden in the beer casks, which would be collected empty from the castle and then brought back forth as a means of getting in and out of the castle secretly.
But little did Mary know that she was playing the most dangerous game of her life. Her arch-enemy, William Cecil, had employed England's cleverest and most ruthless spy to catch her in the act.
Francis Walsingham basically invented modern espionage. He invented messages hidden in the bindings of books, codes, how to open a letter so nobody would know their letters had been read.
Walsingham and his spy ring were watching Mary closely.
They wanted to find conclusive proof that this devilish woman not only approved of Elizabeth's assassination, but was anxious to take part in it.
Babington writes a letter and says, okay, we can do this. When you go out riding one day, and my friends are going to come and release you, another group of friends are going to go and pop off Elizabeth. Mary thinks about this. She doesn't react to this all at once. And then she calls her secretaries together and she dictates a reply.
The affair being thus prepared, then shall it be time to set the 6 gentlemen to work. Upon the accomplishing of their design, I may be suddenly transported out of this place.
Walsingham intercepted the letter, which was written in code. When his decoder deciphered the letter, he drew a gallows in one corner of it, because it was such cast-iron evidence of Mary's guilt.
I don't even think Mary thought the plot would succeed. I think she was living in a bubble of delusion. I think she was a bored, half-crazed, lonely, frightened woman at the end.
Now, Cecil and Walsingham had hard proof that Mary was a traitor. But what would Elizabeth do?
The discovery of hard evidence of the Babington plot puts Elizabeth under enormous psychological pressure. She has been prevaricating for years, she has been closing her eyes for years, and she also knows that she's being put under pressure by her own ministers, which Elizabeth, as a very independent woman, never likes.
The battle between the two queens was reaching its climax. Mary was charged with treason and sentenced to death. But even now, her fate was not sealed. Mary's death warrant needed her cousin Elizabeth's signature before it could be delivered.
Even after all of this, Elizabeth is not going to execute a fellow anointed queen. Not just like that.
She must have been aware of her own mother, Anne Boleyn, who had also been executed and been beheaded in the same way. So you're not telling me that that wasn't in her mind?
There is no way that Elizabeth can live with herself if she is responsible for the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. This is the most important thing anybody ever needs to know about Elizabeth. That the execution of Mary is Elizabeth's armada of the soul.
What happens at the end is the ideal solution for almost everybody involved. Elizabeth signs the warrant but doesn't send it. Cecil and his friends on the council send the warrant.
I believe that Elizabeth signed the death warrant unwillingly, but still signed it knowingly. And I believe that Cecil took the window of opportunity that he'd sought for so many years, and the death warrant was delivered.
At the end of the day, Elizabeth does sign that death warrant. So she has to be held complicit in the death of Mary. But it is one of the moments in her reign where she certainly feels most powerless.
Mary was led to the block in a private ceremony at Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire. Elizabeth did not attend the execution.
There's a plinth 12 by 12, 2 feet high, 2 executioners. She climbs upon the plinth.
There's a letter in which Elizabeth says to Mary, "Where did it all go wrong? Here we are, queens of neighbouring kingdoms. I did my best. Something terrible happened. Now, we've ended as, mortal enemies." She has regrets.
It was an absolutely starring performance. It was the greatest performance of her life.
She puts her arms out like a bird, crying, "Manus Teus, into thy hands I commend my spirit."
Elizabeth knew that she was neutralizing the greatest threat to her own life and to her own rule. But she also knew that she was letting the hounds of hell out of the door. She knew that she had set a precedent for the execution of a sovereign monarch on British soil.
And he swings at her with the axe. She still lives. She's heard muttering something, crying out. Then he has to go at her again.
He cuts away, like a butcher's block, the last sinews of her head.
I've always maintained that Mary was the unluckiest queen in British history.
The disaster of Mary, Queen of Scots' life was due entirely to her own bad choices.
I think she does become the doomed romantic queen of fiction. She is one of the saddest of all historical figures in the British Isles.
Mary never achieved her dream of sitting on the throne of England, but her son James did. Although estranged from Mary in life, James honoured his mother by commissioning a grand tomb for her in Westminster Abbey. She still lies there today, alongside none other than her cousin, Queen Elizabeth.
It's one of history's little ironies that here we have two queens who never met, who were bitterly divided, are now united in death in the House of Kings.
In December 1916, Gregory Rasputin's body was found floating in a freezing river. How did a Siberian peasant rise to the height of power in Tsarist Russia? Who wanted him dead? And why?
That's next Thursday at 8. Next tonight, we're delighted that Alex Polizzi is back and has a reservation at the Fieldhead in Cornwall, where the owner's old-fashioned approach is losing them shed loads of money in the new Hotel Inspector.